Patrick will be joining us shortly. We're on late because we're having some connection issues. I had some Wi-Fi issues, and Patrick, I think, is in some different live stream room than I'm in, and he's got to leave where he is and join me. But I'm sure he'll figure that out soon. In the meantime, welcome to the live stream. If this is your first time here, my name is Nick Dagan Best. My temporarily absent partner in this operation is Patrick Watson. He should be on soon, any second now. Watson, whenever you're ready, just jump on in, and we're here. So once again, thanks for joining us. And today we're going to be sort of picking up where we left off on the Astrology Podcast, talking about Venus retrograde. That was an episode that Chris Patrick and I spent over 3 hours just sort of preparing the outline, what to include, what to exclude, sort of plan it all out. And then even when we got to recording the episode, which took over 4 hours, we wound up leaving a lot of stuff out. Excuse me. We wound up leaving a lot of material out, and therefore we thought we would use today to sort of continue the discussion and pick up where we left off on that show. And yeah, hopefully Patrick joins me. I'm just going to write him and tell him I'm live. Where are you? There we are. Okay. And as soon as he joins us, it will be a juicy live stream today. Yeah, it'll be juicy if Watson gets on board. I don't know where he is. He's apparently... Oh, there he is. All right, fantastic. And the man is here.
Hi. I got locked out of my Restream account. So
okay, yeah. See, I also had some weird issue with the Wi-Fi and connection, so it slowed us down. But here we are, and people are joining in. And we're basically ready to start. You ready? How you doing, Watson?
Yeah, 1 second, just letting people know.
Okay, sounds good.
To let them know that they have to go to your account to see this.
I see. All right.
So you'll have to...
Okay, so far we're getting some kind words about the episode. I was just telling the audience that we're going to... sort of pick up where we left off in that episode and talk some more Venus retrograde today.
Yeah. All right. So I just all right, took care of that. Okay.
All right, good. And you are present, and you have your plastic blue cup of liquid to keep you refreshed. And
yeah, it's
oh, look, it's a sippy cup.
It's a little sippy cup. It's I sometimes think of it's being like the blue dress, from the Venus retrograde of, well, because it's blue.
Oh, geez.
But with some white on.
Really? That's how we're going to say,
Well, it's Venus retrograde, right?
Venus retrograde.
Well, because that's one of the biggest things, one of the biggest things we struggled with talking about Venus retrograde is that it can sometimes be kind of spicy. And there are like some really actually salacious and sometimes really controversial things that come with Venus retrograde. And we really kind of struggled with just trying to keep it as educational and PG as possible. And it was so funny because we tried so studiously to avoid controversy. And then it's really funny because one of the comments was like, wow, this was so dry. It's we did try to keep it that way.
I took that as a comfort. One, mind you, most people seem to be, quite receptive to the episode. I mean, I think the information was solid.
Sure.
But yeah, we really battled some of the stuff that got edited out of the episode that, was just too... deemed like it would get the video demonetized, and I mean, even as it is, I'm sort of surprised if it won't be demonetized. We talked about even some of the stuff that I think stayed in. I think just saying, the name of that German leader, in mid 20th century Germany, sort of fanatical with the mustache, started the war, that guy,
right.
Who's, we talked about him.
And we also talked
in
about Jodie
tandem with,
Foster's filmography that
yeah,
has some controversial themes.
we talked about
Yeah.
that, just sort of like what, not about Jodie Foster herself, but about the
Right.
roles she's played, and sort of where that just the keywords just to describe, like, say, the character she played in Taxi Driver,
Right.
or things of that nature, just to sort of say the name of that job that her character has in that movie, uh, you know, wound up being sort of too
Hard
spicy
to even mention. Yeah.
even for prime time. So there were things like that just we were kind of on eggshells about, and we did our best. I mean, it's still a really long and tight episode, and the fact that it's probably a good sign in the end that some good material. I mean, we just talked about stuff that got edited out, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that we were going to talk about that we just didn't get around to.
Yeah.
And it's a sort of testament to the strength of that episode that, we had to leave so much good stuff out, either because we didn't get to it or because it was just too juicy, too spicy.
Right. Another thing that I thought was kind of funny is that I mean, I guess I find contemporary examples of transit action are useful, if only for the reason that more people might be familiar with it and will be able to sort of immediately connect what you're trying to talk about. Although some people seem to have the wrong impression that, like, that means, like, for example, that I must be like a big, like, Megan Fox and Machine Gun Kelly fan. Like, I've
Yeah.
used them a lot as examples because they're illustrative, but not because I'm actually sort of, I don't know, a fan or
No.
something like that. And that's another kind of big thing we kept coming into, is like, just because we're bringing up, like, problematic figures, has no bearing on our, feeling about them. You have to, would so, and that's hard for people to separate sometimes, even though it seems rudimentary.
I think some people, when they study astrology, they study themselves, they study their families and friends, and then they study, like, the pop stars or movie actors or TV actors or whoever that they admire, the sports figures. And whereas, like, we've made a life out of just studying human life, and we study good people, we study bad people. It's not really our sort of moral assessment of a given individual is not has really nothing to do, or very little to do, with how we rate them as a subject to be studied astrologically. I not only study that German guy we were talking about, the Austrian with the mustache, but Stalin. You know, there was a thing, a little problem when Chris and I did our episode about Uranus and Gemini, and I talked about Robert E. Lee, and someone complained that I was sort of advocating for Robert E. Lee, and I was like, no, I'm just talking about his chart and how he saw the world, which isn't the same thing as sort of advocating for that. Empathy is not synonymous with sympathy. So astrology is this tool for empathy, to sort of understand someone's perspective. And that then absolutely includes stepping into the shoes of some really awful people who saw the world in really stupid ways. But that's kind of, for these purposes, that's besides the point. It's a matter of just sort of understanding everything astrologically, whether or not you agree with this or that individual. And I would never want to be sort of confused with. I mean, some of my favorite subjects are people that I just think are loathsome. Tsar Nicholas II or Richard Nixon, or these are some of my favorite astrological subjects, and they have nothing to do with my attitude towards the actual individuals.
Right. Yeah, the astrology is good. The astrology is good.
That's it. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm glad we live. I think there's a few things we need to acknowledge, like the Robert E. Lee thing. We do live in a world of dog whistles. You know what I mean? We do live in a
Yeah.
world where people use, sort of
innocuousness
Yeah.
as a
Yeah,
kind of
what? I'm just talking about,
weapon.
yeah,
I'm just asking questions.
exactly.
Why those ones? All right.
Right. And
Yeah.
so, and with that in mind, I understand why someone might think that if I'm talking about the horoscope of Robert E. Lee, that, maybe, just maybe, I'm some kind of closet Confederate,
Right. Which is
supporter, and
hilarious if you know anything about you.
yeah,
Right.
right.
Yeah.
It's sort of, nothing could be further from the truth. But, I've read a couple of books about the man's life, and I've read a bunch of books about the Civil War. And when I study the Civil War astrologically, I absolutely look at all the Union generals and all the Confederate generals. I mean, that's how you study a war astrologically, or that's part of
Mhm.
what you do. There's a lot more that you do, but that's absolutely part of it. It's absurd, like, oh, because I support the Union, I'm just gonna, look at the Union generals and not talk about the Confederacy. That just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
It's not, we're not trying to win moral battles here. There's a time and place for it. There's a time and place where we take our political stands, but with this kind of investigation of astrology, it just, it's cutting off your feet to if we omitted these studies of these really influential but disreputable people, then we would really be missing out on a lot, I think.
Yeah. No, true. One of the other kind of consistent comments I saw across the comments is that people were really disturbed by bookshelf situations, which
Oh.
you are reasonably excused of, because you literally just moved in. I mean,
Yes.
you got nowhere to go with all these boxes that you still have to unpack. So I think, you definitely deserve a pass. I, however,
You've been living where you are for a while.
I have less of a, yeah. So I think a messy bookshelf is evidence of it being used. Which is probably better than it looking perfect and you know
Yeah,
getting dusty.
I'm kind of kicking myself because for some reason on the episode I wasn't careful with my lighting, which you can see right now my messy bookshelf looks a lot nicer because it's all draped in this blue light. Whereas in the podcast episode, I guess I must have been just distracted, and the blue light only sort of covers something, so it looks a lot rattier, which is no argument, true to life. But yeah, no, I've just sort of well, long story short, yes, this is a new office space for me, and these books need to be organized behind me, and they will be. But these books have been in boxes for 7 years, in
Mhm.
a storage space while I was in South
Right.
Africa, and it's wonderful to be reunited with them. And there's still, and this is only like half the boxes that I need more shelf space and all
Right.
this stuff. So like, yeah, I mean, I'll get, I'll sort it out. This isn't permanent, but alas, this is just the world I'm living in right now, and
Hmm.
people must just understand and accept it.
It's hard to appreciate how mind-blowing the Venus stuff is if you've never thought about Venus in this way.
Yeah.
I've been working with this so long, like this, in the way that you kind of investigate these planets that I'm not want to say it's old hat, because it's always so fascinating, but it's also so common. These patterns are so pervasive that um it's I almost I just kind of expect it. It's just easy to sort of read time in that way. And so reading through some of the comments made me appreciate how kind of mind-blowing this can really be for someone who hasn't investigated their own life in this way. And you were seeing so many people in the comments of the video telling about the different patterns they noticed in their own lives, with all kinds of
Yeah.
variations of that, but often having some of these underlying themes of Venusian complexes.
Yeah, there are one or two people who wanted to sort of take me to task about the fact that I just talk about these quote unquote eminent lives, that I just talk about famous people, and that maybe mere mortal, mere ordinary individuals don't, that these cycles aren't as relative to their lives. And yeah, I mean, I make it a point to I don't talk about clients in my examples. That's a decision I made long ago, and I just that's my feeling about my practice as a consultant, but as a research, I
I'm sure
can
if you
at
could
least.
ask for permission.
Yeah, well, I mean, others do, and you ask their permission, that's fine. But I won't do it, like, ever.
Mhm.
That's a line I drew long ago. That's just how I feel about how I do things. I'm not. It's not a judgment on how anyone else does things.
Mhm.
Um, but I will say that, I mean, I see several clients a day in most instances, and this kind of stuff always comes up, and it's always powerful. It's not always Venus. Sometimes it's
Right.
Mars. You know, um, but it just it becomes an integral part of doing a consultation, and it's such a shortcut if you know these cycles, the way you can
Yeah.
sort of zero in on things that would take you a lot longer to work around.
Mhm.
If nothing else, just the efficiency of it. But it's
Yeah.
also, in itself, it's like this really workable method that you can use. You can use as a modern horoscopic astrologer, as a traditional horoscopic astrologer,
Mhm.
even Vedic astrologers. Like, it does not have to be. It's such a simple, basic, universal part
Yeah.
of the natural astronomical system and natural astrological system, that it can be sort of lowered or combined with any sort of actual horoscopic system.
Right. One of the things that we only kind of touched on in the episode, but I think is really important from having seen this in my own life and in the lives of clients, is the importance of the 4-year interval between successive Sun Venus alignments in the same part of the zodiac. So basically your blues and reds,
Yeah,
the fact that if they happen in the same sign, that there's often connections between where a Venus retrograde happens in a given sign and then where it conjoins with the sun 4 years later. So it's not just the 8-year interval, but also the 4-year interval, which I think, can complicate things, because then you're having to consider more data points, but it also, those often function really well as like the next sort of narrative step or narrative development. I mean, I've been talking about this with my wife because we've been sort of speculating about what the Venus retrograde will mean for us, and so we've been able to trace back not just through Venus retrogrades, but also Sun Venus conjunctions, and those work really well. I mean, there are so many people in my life. Like, there was this girl I dated briefly in college. We like dated briefly for like a couple months, and then like it just so happened that 4 years later was when we met back up again, again at the same sort of Venus phase. In fact, I think there was like a 4-year interval between when I first met um, Austin and Caitlin of Sphere and Sundry in person, and then 4 years later we met up again at another conference, almost in the
mhm,
same part of the year. Like, there was this kind of Venus connection there.
yeah,
We've noticed this with like some of our family friends, that there's this like 4-year interval. There was a girl that I met online in college, and then 4 years later, that was at the Sun Venus conjunction in Libra of 2006, and then we actually met up in person 4 years later uh, during the next Venus alignment in 2010, during that Venus retrograde in Scorpio, um, and so that 4-year interval is like important as
hmm.
well as the 8-year. What do you make of that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. When I look at it, in a mundane sense, as well, just like in world events, you can see that 4-year sort of turnover
Rhythm.
between that rhythm, or that counter rhythm, if you will, or whatever, however you want to describe it. I mean, it comes up all the time, all the
Mhm.
time.
The 1 and 3, or the 2 and 4. Yeah.
Right, or they might both be ones, but the sort of an alternating, two melodies or something of that
Mhm.
nature. Yeah. For those
Counter melody.
who don't know what we're talking about, we've often likened, like a sonodic return, a particular one, like, for instance, the conjunctions that happen in the rising sign. Very often, those ones coincide with a time in a period's life, in a person's life, that is sort of like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another, a very sort of natural, sort of uh, um, new period in a person's life that you can really detect very easily. Um,
We have a couple of really interesting questions.
Okay.
Pixie says, do you guys think that knowing about these Venus cycles can somehow screw or change fate? Does the fact that you're expecting something work against the timing of things? I would say it
Um,
doesn't matter. It
yeah,
happens
no.
regardless, whether you
Yeah,
know
no,
about it
no,
or
it's
not.
like, yeah, I don't think, I mean, I think, the thing about being aware of astrology is it certainly can inform choices you make. But you know how life is, like, there's some periods in life when a person has a lot of choice, other periods where there isn't much, and they just have to sort of respond to whatever is imposed on them, rightly or wrongly. I think different people, different individual humans, clearly have access to more control over their destiny than other people. And then most people sort of go through periods where they'll have more or less control over their situation depending on a number of factors. And so that gets very slippery. I mean, the one thing astrology can do is if you can actually affect the outcome of a situation, then certainly knowing astrology can help you make the most informed choice in terms of how to do that. And then if you can't control circumstances, if you just don't have enough money, or you've got, family members you're loyal to and therefore can't do the thing you feel you need to do, or whatever the situation is, or the government is on your neck for one reason or the other, and any of those things, and you can't sort of control them, or some natural disaster happens, or you have some sort of health crisis that you can't do much about, any of those things that you just can't control. Astrology in those instances at least equips you with the sort of the perspective to understand that that in some sense this is sort of meant to be, and that you can sort of see your situation realistically and at least respond in the best way possible. So one way or the other, whether you have the control over the outcome or you don't, astrology in both instances really lends itself to helping a person cope with life and get the best out of life.
Yeah. I think that certainly maps with the way that we experience things. We experience time sort of linearly, so that, we have cause and we have effect, and that notion of causality is pretty much baked into our entire experience. But I wonder sometimes if I'm in some ways I'm a bit harder of a determinist than most astrologers, meaning that I believe that things are probably more fated than anyone is really comfortable with, and I think that free will is kind of an illusion, a very very convincing one, and one that you might as well act like you have, given that it's so convincing. But I also wonder if it may not be such that things are just it's not so much that things are fated, but that the structure of time itself is determined, so that therefore everything, like the past affects the future, that the present is informed by the past, that then future things also determine the past, and in some ways future events may even affect the present or the past. That I mean, and I've even kind of wondered about this with eclipses, for example, because a lot of people have this experience of events that seem to anticipate eclipse events, especially at certain intervals from that eclipse, like say the previous lunation. Um, and it's almost like the significance of the eclipse itself, in the future, like sort of causes certain things that have to happen in anticipation toward it, in order for that to the significance of that event to have the meaning that it does. Um, so I realized, like, this kind of retro causal view I'm kind of putting out there is somewhat radical, but I think there's actually evidence for it. Um, in the work of Chris Carolan, he's this financial analyst who wrote this book called The Spiral Calendar, where he shows that there are these um, basically logarithmic relationships between new moons or full moons and market events that correspond with the square roots of the Fibonacci sequence in lunar units, which show that these sort of emotional market turning points correspond to these uh, lunar derived units, both forward and backward from a given lunar event. And so you end up you end up seeing like this kind of symmetry in time through markets that goes both forward and backward. So there are like future new moons and full moons that have sort of, I guess, temporal relationships with times in the past that we're still kind of moving along the path of. This is obviously a really radical view that hasn't even really, been explored in like astrology before, but and he's not even an astrologer, right? He's just coming at this as a guy trying to make money from the markets.
Sure. Although since it involves new and full moons, it is an
Right.
astrology of
Yeah,
sorts.
it is.
It's not
No,
astrology
for
as we
sure.
recognize it, but it's by
Right.
definition an
It's
astrology.
Right. No, it's kind of a logarithmic approach to astrology
Sure.
as opposed to a
Yeah.
linear or arithmetic view of time. And but the whole reason I bring this up is because it shows that we might be living along like mathematical or temporal structures that are determined. So it's not so much that like you're just fated because everything is doomed, but it's like certain things have to happen because that is just how time is shaped. It's sort of like trying to argue against the idea that the corner of a square is 90 degrees. It's like just a mathematical. It's just sort of baked in to
Yeah.
the shape of time itself that certain things sort of have to go a certain way, and so I think being aware of the Venus cycles, I think being aware of something like astrology is also baked into our destiny. We just happen to be people whose destiny it is to have some idea of this way of looking at time and to go through the experience of enjoying and exploring it.
Yeah. I mean, I've certainly, if my involvement with astrology has certainly led me to the conclusion that life is a lot more mapped out than it appears. But at the same time, even if free will is a total illusion, it's an illusion that's baked into like the physical reality of life.
Yeah.
Like even if I'm sure I chose to wear a gray T-shirt today. Maybe it was fated. Maybe it was always, it wasn't my choice. I just think I chose it. Well, I still experienced it as a choice, like
Yeah.
100%. It's merely theoretical that I could think like, yeah, maybe it was always mapped out that I would choose to wear this shirt on this day.
Right.
But it's abstract. It's theoretical. I mean, I think that's, in terms of our investigation of astrology, like we don't want to just sort of remain in the theoretical. We always want to sort of be, taking this toy out of its box and playing with it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I don't want to dabble too much in
Yeah.
the theoretical.
No, no.
It's I mean, I'm
Right.
not unsympathetic to the argument, but at the end of the day, it's kind of irrelevant unless
Sure.
unless like these goldfish can like find a way to like soar out of the bowl and look at the bowl from
Right.
the outside. Like what are
Right. Well, that's really the big problem is we can't get outside of this to know what the shape of the whole thing is like.
No.
We're the equivalent of that Greek mathematician who figured out the curvature of the earth based on the length of the shadows of the of those like monuments at those two different locations, but we're doing that with time.
Yeah.
We can't step outside of time, so we don't really know how time is shaped. We know that it has we know that it has this kind of cyclical quality to it, but it's just a question of are these just linear spirals, or are these like expanding or logarithmic spirals? Like what's the sort of shape of time? We don't quite know that. And I'd say it is, while it is abstract or theoretical, I would also say that just on a very practical level, for example, if the Saturn-Pluto conjunction was always going to be about the emergence of coronavirus and the cultural change that would bring about, then there was a set of conditions that had to be present in order for that to occur. So if it was always going to be about that development for the world, then in essence it was caused by the things that happened before, and thus the significance of that eclipse in the future, or rather of that conjunction at that time in 2020, it's almost like, did that cause the events that led up to it?
Yeah, it's funny that I've been thinking about this just sort of politically, like in terms of where we are now. Like, was this really what it was always meant to come to? Like, there's this Revolutionary War in the 1770s, and you get this new republic that sort of represents this new era in global history, and one country after another follows them into revolution and totally changing their system of government, and then we wind up in this sort of heavily industrialized planet full of waste and garbage and all this stuff we've produced out of as a result of these revolutions and the lifestyles that they gave us. And like, is that what this was all leading up to? Like, the current climate, is this really, I mean, obviously not, it's still going somewhere else, but I really have come to sort of see history this way. Certainly modern history is this just sort of this one big event that, with a bunch of sort of debris and what have you, sort of spreading everywhere else. All right. Shall we dig into some Venus retrograde talk proper?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to today talk about some of the stuff that we left out. It was my feeling. I think we did a good job with the episode, but overall it just there was so much more we could talk about, that we could show, and I wanted to get into some examples that I thought would have been that much more useful for people who are still sort of engaged in the subject. So here, I'm going to share my screen.
Okay.
I'm going to go to just, these are some old favorites of mine. All right, so we'll start with these people.
Oh my gosh. This could be very timely.
Gee, you think? Okay, so Lyndon Johnson, who's there on the top left, born in 1908. Thurgood Marshall at the top right, also born in 1908. George H.W. Bush at the bottom left, born in 1924. Clarence Thomas, born in 1948, at the bottom right. And then Anita Hill, born in 1956, bottom center. All five of these individual human beings were born during the red 3. Sorry, you know what? It says phase and it should say interval. This is such an old slide that I made years ago. And I don't think I even had... There. I don't think I even had the terms like worked out yet. There, corrected. That's such an old slide. That's really funny. I updated all the slides here except this one, and I just realized it's mislabeled. So anyway, so all five of these individuals are born during red 3 Venus intervals. And then, as you may or may not have surmised by this point, Thurgood Marshall was appointed the first African-American Supreme Court justice in 1967. And when he stepped down in 1991, he was replaced by Clarence Thomas, the second African-American man to be appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. So the first and second of this, glass ceiling being broken. And they were both appointed and confirmed during red 5 intervals. So I just want to take you through the slides quickly. Thurgood Marshall here, born July 2nd, 1908. He is a red 3 setting D. You can see the sun and Venus in Cancer with Venus retrograde. He was born 18 days after the retrograde station, just 3 days before the interior conjunction. Later that summer, the man who would appoint him to the court, Lyndon Johnson, a total angel of a man. Jokes. He is so he's also a red 3 like Thurgood Marshall, but he's a rising B as opposed to a setting D because he was born with a morning star Venus 30 days after the direct station, but still another 21 days before the greatest elongation, or 20 days before the greatest elongation of Venus. keeping him in the red 3 interval. Then Lyndon Johnson, after Lyndon Johnson, George H.W. Bush. There have only ever been 3 red 3 presidents, and they're all vice presidents who sort of, well, 2 of them. The first one is Harry Truman, who replaced Franklin Roosevelt. Johnson, of course, replaced John F. Kennedy. And Reagan didn't die, but Bush was very much like sort of, got to the presidency on his coattails, if it were. So George H.W. Bush is also a red 3, a setting D, like Clarence Thomas. Right. And then we get to Clarence Thomas, like Thurgood Marshall, rather. Clarence Thomas is a red 3 setting D. He was born with Venus retrograde under the beams 20 days after the retrograde station and just 1 day before the interior conjunction. And then finally, Anita Hill, born July 30th, 1956, 16 days after the Venus direct station. She is a red 3 rising B. So these are 5 individuals and 2 events that are really, that have tremendous weight in American history. Goes without saying. And it's this kind of Chris is on here asking a question. Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute, Chris.
Chris, who of the astrology
podcast? What are these wannabes messing with the big boys for? Huh?
We're gonna make that joke like every time Chris Brennan shows up in the comments. Just
if you want to be my lover,
get with my friends. All right.
So yeah, really, that was just my point. Yeah, the 3 of us really should have been a boy band. Yeah. We kind of are, actually. What am I saying? So there you go. You've got the 2 presidents, the 2 justices, and then Anita Hill, who, I mean, if you don't know her place in the Clarence Thomas story, I don't want to get sort of sidetracked with that today. Either you know the history or you don't. You can sort of look it up, but let's just say she's quite central and important to the Clarence Thomas story and to this overall story arc.
1991. That also happens to be that. So that's a red 5 interval, which is the one that we're now in today, right? The connection then is possibly
that's right.
That there would be a kind of renewed attention on kind of, I guess, like misdeeds,
the misdeeds of Clarence Thomas. Although now, like Samuel Alito, who is a red 4, has also been sort of brought. Now we're getting more Supreme Court justices. So yeah, the red 3 and the red 4 are in trouble now. Sarah, I've seen the Frontline documentary. It is fascinating. And Catherine Thomas is asking if Joe Biden has apologized to her yet. I don't think he has. He was on the committee that grilled her. It was not the most savory footage. And I remember I was watching them at the time, and it was pretty hard to watch. I gotta say, watching. I mean, she had a lot of courage. No, he's a blue 2.
Blue 2.
Biden's a blue 2, which is a popular interval for U.S. presidents. Reagan was also a blue 2. Okay, well, Chris or whoever this strange astrology podcast dude is with his pesky questions, he's asking about Russia. Maybe I just go into this quickly. Because, as for people watching, that just these past few days, there was an attempted coup in Russia. And I do have slides pertaining to this. Maybe I should have. Yeah, this is how many slides I have. There we are. Okay, I'm going to need a second to open it. I'll just wait for that to open. So basically, for those of you, if you haven't been paying attention to the news these past 48 hours, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's the head of the Wagner Group, the sort of paramilitary group that is they're Russian, but not officially sort of aligned with the Russian government. Although up until this past weekend, they've always thought to have been sort of Putin's, little private army on the side. They're involved in all kinds of operations around the globe, from Syria to Mali to Sudan, um, Burkina Faso, a lot of sort of French Africa, which has been dealing with Islamic extremism, and the French military was there to try to help for a while, but they've been expelled, and the Wagner group has sort of come in as a replacement. So it's a really kind of big, expansive private army that's got operations, like I said, in the Middle East and Africa. And this past weekend, Prigozhin directed his little private army against the actual Russian regime. And they took over the city of Rostov-on-Don, which is the Russian city that's like closest to the UK, to the Ukrainian front. And it's basically sort of like the main supply chain for the Russian army coming west from Russia to fight in Ukraine. So it's sort of like, blocking off all that access. And he said he was going to sort of advance on Moscow. He was denounced as a traitor by Vladimir Putin. And just a few hours ago, like late yesterday, Prigozhin suddenly announced that he was turning his army around and that he wasn't going to advance on Moscow after all. So it's a very sort of, people are just generally puzzled by this, this behavior of his, and even more puzzled by the way it sort of it ended as much as by the way it started. So I'm just gonna I've covered this before in the live stream much earlier, but I'm just going to bring it up again because it's relevant to now, and a lot of people want to know, and it's a really great Venus retrograde example. All right, so Putin himself, according to the birth date we have, October 7th, 1952. It's probably his correct birthday. I've talked before about the fact that there's this sort of counter theory that he was born in Georgia 2 years earlier. I don't really necessarily believe that. I did bring it up just because, I felt I had to make full disclosure that that story is out there. But anyway, most likely he's born during on October 7th, 1952, with your classic sort of Saturn-Neptune conjunction that you find a lot in Russian history. This, of course, this was only about 5-6 months before the death of Stalin, which was one of the big Saturn-Neptune events in 20th century Russian history. Also in 1917, at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, Saturn and Neptune were conjunct. And in 1989, as the Berlin Wall fell and the Iron Curtain was falling, that was also a Saturn-Neptune conjunction event. So there's...
And in 2025, when that happens again, it could blow by with nothing.
I'll get to that. So even though Putin is not born with Venus retrograde, he's a black 2 interval, and he's in fact the first Russian leader to be a black 2 interval, which typically is more common in sort of with American presidents, for instance. Richard Nixon, Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, they're black 2 presidents. But regardless, Leo may or may not be Putin's midheaven, but one thing is certain is that the Red 5 Venus retrograde interval, the Venus retrograde that we're in now, that we're heading into now, the Leo one, just has this recurring presence in his timeline, in his life story. And we start first, like just his mother was born during a Red 5 interval on the 17th of October, 1911. So she was born under that interval. And then he, of course, was born in 1952 when she was 41 years old, or just turning 41 years old. And he grew up in St. Petersburg, which, of course, was Leningrad during the Soviet years. And he wanted to be a KGB agent. He was told he had to sort of study law. And so he went to the University of Leningrad and graduated in 1975. And when I was in St. Petersburg, our tour guide also went to the University of St. Petersburg, and he confirmed for me that, as in North America, Russian university students there, they finish their year typically in June. There'll be exams in June, and that's when you graduate. And the story is that Putin, after graduation, immediately went and enlisted in the KGB. So I don't have an exact date, but I do know that he graduated in 1975, which probably was around June. And in 1975, the Red 5 interval began on June 15th, and he enlisted in the KGB after graduating. And so it's a very strong likelihood that he joined the KGB during the Red 5 interval. Now, 8 years after 1975, in 1983, Putin got married during a Red 5 interval. So, I mean, this is a big deal. He wound up starting a family. His oldest daughter is actually a Red 1 interval, which is really common for Russian leaders who have children born in Red 1 intervals. Don't ask me why, but it is.
Right.
Brezhnev, Khrushchev, Stalin. Lenin didn't have kids, but Tsar Alexander III, Tsar Alexander the Second, Nicholas the First, they all had kids. It's just the weirdest thing. They all had kids born during Red 1 intervals. A very common thing with Russians. Anyway, he got married, which is a big event in a person's life. 8 years after 1983, here's some foreshadowing for you. There was an attempted coup that failed. And it was because of this coup, the story goes, that Putin finally resigned from the KGB. Now, he had been in this famous during a year and a half earlier. He was stationed in Dresden, or is it Dresden or one of those other sort of Saxon cities? I think it's Dresden. Correct me if I'm wrong, chap. Anyway, he's stationed in East Germany as a KGB agent. And when the Berlin Wall came down, there were riots in that city, and the people went after the Stasi, who were the East German sort of version of the KGB, and they were ransacking their offices. And Putin, they were going to sort of advance on the KGB offices as well. And Putin sort of stood down and chased them away, the story goes. And this would have been during the Red 4 interval of, late 89, early 1990. So now it's a year and a half later, and the Soviet Union is going to officially come apart a few months later at Christmas. But there's this final sort of stab at maintaining the Soviet Union, an attempted coup against Gorbachev's government, and Boris Yeltsin sort of steps in and helps protect the regime. And as a result of this attempted coup, because the KGB were involved, Putin officially resigns from the KGB during a Red 5 interval. So remember, in 1975, Putin joined the KGB during a Red 5 interval, and now he resigns during a Red 5 interval. Okay. Now, you remember earlier I told you that Putin's mother was born during a Red 5 interval. Well, also, his father died during a Red 5 interval. His mother died a few months before this. I don't have an exact date, but she probably didn't also die during the Red 5 interval. But his father dies on the 2nd of August, 1999, during a Red 5 interval. And he goes to the funeral in what is now again called St. Petersburg, because the Soviet Union is over. And as soon as he gets back to Moscow after his father's funeral, he's invited to become Russia's 5th prime minister in a year and a half. Yeltsin has appointed a succession of prime ministers, 5 since early 1998. And the Russian economy is failing. They defaulted on their debt the previous year. Things are a real mess. And Yeltsin is worried that he'll appoint someone who'll turn around and hold them accountable for the failing Russian economy. So part of his motivation to appoint Putin prime minister is to appoint someone that he knows will just sort of let him get on with life. And in fact, that's what happened. So this date, August 9th, 1999, during the Venus retrograde in Virgo, 10 days after the retrograde station, 11 days before the interior conjunction. This is another Red 5 event. And this was the first day that most of us on planet Earth heard the name Vladimir Putin. Before this, there were a handful of, sort of Russian government people. And then, I'm sure like the CIA and people like that knew who Putin was. But the general public, he came out of total obscurity, and first was named Russian prime minister during this Red 5 interval. And then by the end of the year, Yeltsin stepped down and Putin was, quote unquote, elected president.
I would also note that was just about 3 days or so before that solar eclipse in Leo.
Yes.
That was the focus of great scrutiny by astrologers because of the way that it opposed Uranus, squared Saturn, and Mars at the same time. It's like this grand malefic cross involving a solar eclipse in Leo. And so what happens at that time is you get the emergence of a new world leader who is a, kind of a problem.
Yeah, to put
It's
it
a malefic leader. And if he did have Leo in the midheaven, that solar eclipse would happen, on the North Node in his 10th house.
correct.
So we can see why these Venus retrogrades that go from Virgo into Leo would potentially be important for his professional life, and these have been so far. Well, with the exception of the marriage one. I'm not sure how that fits into it, except that it is sort of an inherently Venus-y event.
Well, yeah, I mean, there've been a few biographers who speculate that Putin, the only reason Putin got married was because it would help advance him in the KGB. That sort of single men were not promoted. Yeah, I mean, I've read quite a few books about him, and I mean, it's speculation, but he's divorced from her now. She couldn't stand being part of public office,
and that wasn't a Venus retrograde event when they got separated.
Well, when they announced it, it wasn't, but I think you never know what's going on behind the scenes.
Right.
But the long and short of it is, yeah, I don't want to go into the whole, I mean, I know the story of their courtship and all this, but he wasn't like, he's no Romeo, like he didn't kind of, yeah, there's enough to sort of deduce from the way it all, sort of unraveled that, yeah, very likely, he couldn't advance in the KGB unless he was a married man. So he got married and had a family.
Okay. I didn't quite understand the specific dynamics of that. That's actually quite interesting. Anyway, I didn't want to derail you. So so he joined the KGB. He advances himself in the KGB through marriage. He resigns from the KGB due to the failed coup, and then he becomes prime minister under a Venus, or all under the same phase of Venus going
the same interval,
Leo, the same interval. Pardon.
Yeah, the same interval, and the fact that his mother was born during one and his father died during one. You always look for those things. You always look for the deaths of parents and other important family members and friends. When you're doing, even for like a public person like this, where obviously his parents don't have anything directly to do with his political career, but that's kind of the point. You're reinforcing that his political life with these unambiguously important personal dates. You don't whether he loved his mother or hated her or whatever, the death of a mother is an important event in a person's life, no matter what their attitude is. Not that there's no indication that he hated his mother by any. I'm just saying, like, it wouldn't matter if he had. It's still a really sort of critical event. All right, so just moving along. 8 years after becoming prime minister, Putin's now been president for quite a while. And he personally goes to Guatemala City to petition the Olympic Committee to allow Sochi, which is a resort town in Russia on the Black Sea, not too far from Crimea. He wanted to host the 2014 Olympic Winter Games. And Russia was considered a sort of not a favorite to win this, but Putin went and petitioned personally. And he actually did it in English. One thing people don't realize is that Putin speaks English. Like, you'll see him meeting politicians and he speaks Russian and there's a translator and all that stuff, but his English is actually pretty good, I'd say. So the speech that I have in the photo here, this is he's doing the application in English. That's how much he wanted the Olympic Games, that he would even expose himself speaking, the enemy's language, if you will. So this winds up being important. As it happened, Russia did host the Winter Olympic Games in early 2014, and they went very well. By all accounts, they were a success, except as soon as they were over, they occurred during a Red 4, and as soon as they were over, Russian, the Wagner group that I was talking about earlier, they invaded Crimea. These mass troops arrived on Simferopol and other parts of the Crimea, and this was the beginning of Russia taking the Crimea and everything that has ensued from there. Right. But that's a Red 4. That's just a little sidebar because it connects to that Red 5. Like, he wanted the Olympics and he got them. All right. Then the next Red 5, this is the last Red 5 in 2015. Putin and Obama was still president at this point. They had an encounter at the United Nations, and Putin, this is the Syria thing was just going on. and Putin was able to make Obama look bad at the United Nations. And you can see it, just this look in their faces, right? You can see who feels like they've triumphed and who feels like they've been had. So that is a timeline of Red 5 events in Putin's life. But there's something else I wanted to just show.
There was one thing I would want to add about that, but yeah, we'll
okay, yeah. Putin's wife is a Red 4, by the way. Just that's a little aside, not necessarily relevant to what I'm talking about, but I'm looking for someone specific here. Oh, is he not here? Okay, I'm gonna have to pull him from somewhere else. Because I want to talk about the guy who tried to launch this coup, Prigozhin. He is... Bear with me here. No, he's not Cory Booker. Cory Booker is another bald man, but he's not the guy leading the coup against the Soviet Union. Wait, there he is. Prigozhin, Yevgeny Prigozhin. The date of birth we have is the 1st of June, 1961. That's the date that we get everywhere. There's no contradictory date. There's no necessarily reason to doubt it, but it is just a Russian date of birth that we're given, and we sort of have to accept. But if this date of birth is correct, this means Prigozhin was born during a Red 1 interval. And he was that meaning like 30 days after the direct station, but still 20 days before the greatest elongation of Venus, still very much in the loopy part of the Venus retrograde and the sort of the little dance it does during the red interval. Now, the reason the Red 1 is important is because it plays a really big role in Russian history already, in events and in nativities. I've got the Red 1 here. Let me just sort of take you through some Russian Red 1s in history here. Let's start with, where is she? There she is, Catherine the Great. She was a Red 1. Catherine the Great is, first of all, she's the Russian ruler responsible for the fact that Crimea is a part of Russia or Ukraine at all. She was a great sort of expansionist. She expanded the Russian territory to out east towards the Caucasus and beyond, into Siberia, and then down towards Crimea, which she eventually annexed, and so on and so forth. And so she's, this is sort of classic. Red 1s are sort of, when they're political leaders, they tend to be great expansionists. Some other Red 1s in world history include Napoleon and that German guy we were talking about earlier with the little mustache, mid 20th century sort of fanatic guy. That dude, he's a Red 1. Napoleon's a Red 1, Catherine the Great. And even in American history, there's never been a Red 1 president, but William Seward, who was Secretary of State under Lincoln and Johnson, he's the guy who annexed Alaska, Seward's Folly. So even Henry Clay, who was a senator, but he was responsible really for sort of expanding, the West further.
So Red 1s are expansionists.
Red 1s are expansionists. So even in American politics, your Henry Clays, your William Sewards, even if they're not presidents, they're really sort of like active agents for this kind of annexing territories. And that's what you get with Catherine the Great. That's what you get with, again, the Austrian German mustache guy. And so Prigozhin belongs to that group. But there's some other Russians. There's like this guy who was who led the assassination plot against Tsar Paul. This is Count Peter Alexeyevich Palin. He was the leader of this coup that murdered Tsar Paul I, who was the son of Catherine the Great, who was murdered during, he wasn't a natal Red 1, but he was murdered during a Red 1, and the leader of his assassins was a Red 1. And then a little bit later in Russian history, there was, where's the dude I'm looking for? So there's Napoleon, there's Henry Clay, like I was talking about. This guy, Pavel Pestel, he's one of your first sort of Russian revolutionaries. And well, at least after the French, the Russian army sort of fought the French Revolution, and he was the leader of what was called the Decembrist revolt. Now, the Decembrist revolt happened a little bit after a red one. It happened during a white five, but he was a red one sort of revolutionary leader. The Decembrists were Russian military officers who led a coup. Sound familiar? Led a coup that was unsuccessful, and they were all executed. But yeah, like Prigozhin, and like what's his name, Polin, that I showed earlier. These red one guys are in Russian history, they're big with coups. This is the reason I've had my eye on Prigozhin for quite a while, for this very reason, because I was aware of people like Polin and Pestel, who've tried this thing in the past, who've launched coups in the past, successful or otherwise. There's Seward, as I mentioned earlier. And now let's go to our next Russian as I roam through here. Sometimes you get sort of minor characters. This was one of the daughters of Tsar Nicholas I, sort of a favorite daughter, and she was a red one. Remember, I said a lot of Russian leaders have red one children. So she's Nicholas I's red one child. And then we just go through history here. Sergei Witte was he was a prime minister of Imperial Russia. He's the guy responsible for creating the Trans-Siberia Railway. Remember, expansionists. He was right. The mastermind, and it's often thought pioneer. I mean, this was important. Like Russia had Siberia, but you couldn't do anything with it, industrially, until you had a railroad. To this day, it remains the only way that you can really travel across Siberia is this railroad that Witte instigated and had built. Then we get to the other side of coups. This is the Grand Sergei of Russia. He was a red one. He was the uncle of the Tsar Nicholas II, because he was the brother of Nicholas's father, who had been Tsar Alexander III. Grand Duke Sergei is important. First of all, his wife was the older sister of the woman who would become Nicholas II's wife. So he's not only the Tsar's uncle, he's also his brother-in-law. Okay, so it's really, really complicated. And his job, he was basically the governor general of Moscow. And he was assassinated. He was blown to bits by a bomb on the 17th of February, 1905, during a red one interval. He was born during a red one, and he's one of many red one intervals people who were assassinated during red one intervals. Just like his grandfather, Alexander II, who was assassinated during a red one interval in 1881, or like the aforementioned Tsar Paul I, who was assassinated during a red one interval in 1801. Tsar Paul, I guess, would have been Sergei's great-grandfather, I think. I think I have the number of greats right there. But there you go. That's another sort of red one, and his assassination is sort of one of the early events of the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution really began in 1905, and then it sort of went dormant for a while and then came alive again in 1917. And his assassination is, sort of one of those early events that indicate that a real sort of revolution is happening. Right. Then you get some other people. This is another Russian official, not terribly important. Excuse me. This guy Botkin, he was the doctor, the personal doctor to the Romanovs, and he was assassinated alongside with them. There were two red one births who were assassinated in that basement in 1917.
So as you can see, it kind of becomes just overwhelming, okay, red one is huge.
Red one is huge. Yeah.
For Russia.
So here's someone else. Before you had Lenin, you had Kerensky, who was he was the revolutionary leader of the provisional government, who, there were two revolutions in 1917. The Bolsheviks were the second revolution, but this is a guy from the first revolution. And he really, a lot of people thought he, should have been sort of the leader in Russia instead of Lenin, but he was overthrown by the Bolsheviks, and he's a red one. Ironically, he and Lenin grew up in the same town, and their fathers worked together. One of them was the other's boss. I forget if Kerensky's dad was Lenin's dad's boss. They were both in the school system. They were teachers, but it's really weird that they're both from the same little town called Simbirsk. But anyway, Kerensky's really important, albeit he has a very brief reign in 1917, but he's a red one interval, and he's overthrown in the revolution. He wound up living in New York City and dying there. So yeah, I've really gone to town. Here's another one who died in the basement. You remember I'm talking about Russians having red one children. This is Nicholas II's daughter. She was the second oldest daughter, and she was a red one interval. She was murdered in that basement. And then there's a whole lot of other sort of, Russian kids here. Here, this is Stalin's son. He's a red one. This is Khrushchev's daughter. She's a red one. This is Brezhnev's daughter. She's a red one. So I wasn't kidding. Like, just Russian leaders have red one children all the time. And this might be, maybe I'm finally done with all this tedious Russian stuff. Yeah. And then we wind up back. Oh yeah. And this is Putin's daughter. She's a red one. Okay. So yeah, even Putin has a red one.
So we were just looking at 2015 for Putin and that Venus retrograde, in which he kind of shows up Obama at the UN. Yeah. I would say the additional significance of that retrograde for Putin was the fact that that was the same retrograde in which Trump became became popular in the Republican primaries of that summer of 2015. And remember, I don't know exactly when this happened on the right wing of American politics, but they went from being, the hardline anti-Russian conservatives of the 80s to the warm and friendly to Putin, because they respect a sort of strongman approach to governing. And Trump, I think, was a big part of that in sort of popularizing being more embracing of leaders like Putin. And so I think it's interesting that not only during that retrograde does he sort of show up the American president at that time, Obama, but that there's also this ascendant figure on the right wing who kind of has nothing but compliments for him, and almost kicks off this wave of getting Americans, the enemy, to actually sort of admire him in some kind of perverse way. To the extent where you actually get the people who are most hardline against Russia to, now have this kind of perverse admiration for, its autocratic leaders. So I feel like that's a pretty weird turning point to have for Putin.
Yeah.
That he actually ends up sort of persuading his enemy, and then ends up actually getting kind of, the most favorable president possible, out of Trump's candidacy. So
yeah, the thing about the Republicans is they were against the Soviet Union because they were communist, and communists are atheists. It's part of the thing. I mean, you always hear them complaining about the godless communists. So they weren't really concerned about the social conservatism of Russian society. They weren't really concerned about autocratic rule. They just didn't want communism being spread because that was seen as a threat to their empire and their bread and butter. So that was, and with communism removed from the equation, before the Bolshevik revolution, Russia and the U.S. had very good relationships. It's really ironic. Abraham Lincoln and Tsar Alexander II had a regular correspondence. Both of them would be assassinated during red one intervals, as it happens. But, Alexander II was a lot more supportive of the Union, sort of, at least morally, if not, I think also materially, than Britain or France were. They were sort of on the fence waiting to see, who would win and who they could do business with. Russia was always on the side of the Union. So yeah, the Bolshevik Revolution and everything that ensued, the whole Cold War thing, was really sort of a new 20th century creation. I mean, in part, it was aggravated by the fact that in the 19th century, Russia and Britain were in what they call the Great Game. They were sort of the rival empires, and then the U.S. sort of, wound up replacing Great Britain. So some of it is tied into that legacy, but it was only an imperial United States and a communist Russia that put them at odds with each other.
Right. No, that's a great point. So what you're saying is, even the kind of conservative dislike of Russia from the 80s is itself a kind of weird swing of the pendulum, given the United States' relationship with Russia in the 19th century. up into the early 20th century until the Bolshevik Revolution. So it's just interesting to see that, yeah, there's this the pendulum sort of swings again. And I imagine, another thing that the right, seems to like about Putin is like, he doesn't like, he sort of mocks, like gender freedoms in his speeches, and
Well,
he's
yeah,
made
but
very anti-gay type
he's saying
stuff.
that for an American audience as much as anything.
Well, yeah, I mean, really, I think that must be part of the appeal for them,
Yeah.
for the people who sort
Oh,
of feel
yeah.
sort of warmly
I
towards
mean,
Putin.
yeah,
So I
if
just think, yeah,
you're Tucker Carlson, who, by the way, is a red one, if you're Tucker Carlson, the red one, and you hear all this stuff that Putin's saying, you're like, wait a minute, this guy thinks like us. Why are we at war with him? Um, I mean, that's all sort of, yeah. I think it's very
yeah,
well
and
orchestrated.
I'm seeing a comment here, that seems to be confusing being critical of Russia as giving America a free pass.
Yeah,
Yeah, just let go of
yeah, no,
that
no,
right
but
away.
yeah. Well,
I'm
I
not
mean,
giving America a free pass here.
yeah, that may or may not be the point. I think that's just it. Is part of the struggle within the United States, political dialogue itself is a struggle between autocratic ideas, imperialistic ideas, and those that are counter to that.
Right.
If nothing else, the U.S. has an environment where these things can be argued out. But certainly, like,
Right.
there's to point out that there's hypocrisy involved is certainly it's
That's
stating
pretty
the
obvious.
obvious. Yeah, it's stating the obvious. Like, yeah,
So,
we know,
yeah,
we know.
yeah, I mean,
You can have the autocracy that where no questions asked, or else you're thrown out of a window, or you have the autocracy where at the very least there's a semblance of dialogue, a semblance of democratic choice. It
for
is
now,
for now. I mean, there are
right?
huge problems with it, and no one
Yeah,
should be to have illusions about it. But there is still um, there's that, and you can argue there's only that, and that's fine.
yeah,
I
and
wouldn't I
my,
wouldn't argue I wouldn't argue anything more than that either.
I'm just responding to this comment that says a lot of hate for Russia being autocratic, yet American imperialism around the world has been at war for almost as long as its existence. Such a strange hate Americans have towards the Slavs. Yeah, I think what's more fair to say is I hate autocracy. Whether that's Russian or
Yeah,
American. I have nothing against individual Russians.
no,
Necessarily. I mean, sure they have some assholes. I'm sure they have some great people.
yeah. Look,
I don't know if I don't feel the same way towards every American or every English person or what have you. So, I'm not
I
against people, but I tend to have problems with governments. Right,
my heart always goes out to men who are forced to fight wars against their choice
right,
and who are sacrificed in this way.
yeah,
This is an old thing, and no matter where they're from, I promise
that's a
you,
tragedy.
that's like, yeah, I'm always on the side of the human beings who have to go through that.
Yeah,
And so first and foremost, yeah, I'm the son of an American who came to Canada to avoid fighting in Vietnam, and so I really, I've adopted a child who's the daughter of someone who had to leave their home country to avoid military draft. It's like a really big theme for me. It's something that I come from a family, actually, on both sides of my family, of people who've been refugees due to war. So I'm always, as far as going, I'm very much on the side of Russian people, particularly the men who are sort of dragged into this nonsense.
right,
Anyway, Joshua says he's not making a personal attack. I
yeah,
didn't take it as a personal attack. We may have been sort of defensive about it more than we needed to be, but
yeah, maybe.
yeah, I mean, but these things are all they need
Yeah,
saying,
I
and we
just didn't
said
want
them.
anyone to be confused. Like, just because we're being critical of Russia doesn't mean that,
Yeah.
we can't be critical of other people at the same time. Or
Yeah, I think it's fine. Like, if that kind of response is fine. If we were from the American government and we're saying all this stuff, then you can sort of call us out for hypocrisy, but we're not. So it's not
I mean,
our
I
it's
am an
not our
American citizen,
hypocrisy
but
tone.
I'm not a. Yeah, I'm not
Yeah,
a.
yeah. All right. So moving right along, since you mentioned the Trump thing, there was something I've made some slides since last week. But since we got into Trump and we're basically done, I've said my piece about Russia.
Mhm.
I just quickly wanted to go over something that I
Could
was
we
talking about last
briefly
week.
talk a little bit though about then the fact that we are now at the current repetition of Venus?
Yeah,
in going retrograde. I mean,
sure.
that's the final leg of the, this is the, we took a long time going through his whole
True. Yeah,
chronology
you're
with
right.
Venus retrograde. So it's probably worth mentioning, speculations for
That we are now
what it
in a
means for
red,
Putin.
yeah, we are now in a red 5 interval. I've expected, since the war began, I've been looking to this period for like the major turning point in the Ukraine war, at least as far as Putin is concerned. The war can keep going on. He might even just sort of stay in his position, but that's major changes. This coup is very, very weird. The way it sort of it came on really strong, and then suddenly, just as quickly, sort of died down. Everyone's almost sort of pretending it didn't happen or that it was all some misunderstanding, and we know very well that like
This is a very Mercury Neptune kind of coup.
there will be consequences for this. You don't have misunderstandings like this and have it go nowhere. So I mean, yeah, the red 5 is far from over. The Venus hasn't even
Yeah,
gone retrograde yet, and this is just sort of a blip and a foreshadowing, I think, of where these things are going. But I've
right.
made my case. This is what I've been thinking for quite some while. That number one, and I just I make my case based on the history that I've put together and shown you, because the red 5 interval is just always this really critical turning point in Putin's life, unambiguously.
But notably,
Yeah,
not just turning points, but like, well, because some of them are about his turning down power, and some of them are about like ascending to a place of power. Like some of
yes.
them are triumphs, and then other ones are like kind of
Not
decline
necessarily, not
or
necessarily failures, but yeah, downturns or what have you.
downfalls.
Yeah.
For example, you mentioned that, I mean, because the ascending ones, those are the ones where he got into the KGB and then solidified his social status in the KGB by getting married and becoming prime minister. But then we also have, when he gives up, we have
Right.
his resigning from the KGB.
Yeah, although that
Well,
was the 1991, the resigning from the KGB. I mean, there's that old saying that no one really resigns from the KGB. The same thing they say about the CIA. And also, I mean, he did go on to a political career. When he was resigning from the KGB, he had already started working with the city of Leningrad, which was again becoming, actually, Leningrad was renamed St. Petersburg, I think, also like August, September of 91 during the Red 5 interval. Because it had first been changed to Petrograd when there was war with Russia, with Germany rather, in the First World War, and then eventually, of course, it was called Leningrad after the Soviet Union came to power. But yeah, Putin's hometown, St. Petersburg, he was already sort of working with the mayoral candidate. I forget if he had already been elected mayor by that point or he would be, but he wound up getting involved in city government. It wasn't, leaving the KGB was still sort of a step up for him in its own way. But I would really just emphasize that it's very, whether you're the biggest Putin supporter or the biggest, like us, Putin haters, it doesn't matter what you think about the man. Unambiguously, those
right.
red 5 intervals are just clearly, unambiguously, these big turning points in his life. And for that reason, and that reason really alone, given that we don't have a reliable horoscope, this is a great example of how using the synodic cycles this way allows you to sort of do astrology even if you don't have like reliable horoscopic material, that being a documented time of birth or even a reliable date of birth. So that sort of tells its story of itself. But like I said, I've also been looking at Prigozhin because he's a red one, and because I know this history of red ones in Russian history when it comes to coups, be they successful or otherwise, but both the sort of the perpetrators of coups, like the assassination of Tsar Paul I, or the Decembrists, or the victims of coups like Grand Duke Sergei, that it's really sort of baked in there. Red ones are very sort of hot for Russian coups and assassinations and things of that nature. So I knew Prigozhin, knowing he was a red one, I looked at the birthdays that, again, admittedly, all we have are these sort of birthdays of all the sort of people around Putin. Because that's how I study leaders. I always look at their, the people who write their speeches, their defense secretaries, and whoever else they work with. So I looked at Prigozhin, and I knew as the red one in Putin's orbit, no pun intended, that very likely he's like the guy who's going to turn around. And since he was the head of Wagner, it wasn't hard to surmise on those grounds either.
Right.
But where I think this is going is, regardless, like Putin could be taken down during this Red 5, or it could just be like this really sort of, like a period where he's rendered politically, useless, like maybe he keeps his position, but he just doesn't have the clout that he's had. But one way or the other, where this all goes is, you mentioned 2025, when there's going to be a Saturn Neptune conjunction. You know what else is happening in 2025? The next red one, Venus retrograde in the spring of 2025. So there's this whole, 2025 is ultimately what I'm really looking toward.
It's a perfect storm.
Yeah. This red 5 for the summer of 2023. I think this is important for Putin, whether it's the end of Putin or just sort of the neutralizing of Putin's power or something of that nature. But then when we get to the red 1, whether Putin's still in power or whether Prigozhin's taken over in a coup, or Prigozhin's executed a coup and put someone else in power, which isn't nearly as likely, but whatever the sort of outcome, that red 1 with that Saturn Neptune conjunction,
that's huge. That is
the point where I'm really looking, for this whole
like
story,
the new Russia to emerge almost from that. Fascinating stuff. What about the fact that the invasion began at within days of that Venus-Mars conjunction in Capricorn, just after the retrograde in Capricorn, and the fact that Venus will almost make a conjunction to Mars just before it stations retrograde this July. And then the fact that there will be the next time that Mars and Venus will complete a conjunction will be in February of 2024. What do you make of those interactions with Venus Mars? Because while you're known as like the Venus guy, well, in addition to being a human ephemeris, also known for your work on Venus, you've also done a lot of work with Mars as well. So I would think that you might have. I would wonder what your thoughts are on the Venus Mars story here potentially.
Well, when you're looking at Venus and Mars, you're taking that 8-year synodic cycle of Venus and you're merging it with the synodic cycle of Mars, which involves alternate sums of 15 and 17. So your first Mars return is 15, but then the next one is 17 years later, which adds up to 32, and 32 is a multiple of 8. So with that, we get a merging of the Venus and Mars cycles every 32 years. So in 2022, when you had the Venus-Mars conjunction, we had 3 Venus-Mars conjunctions with that Venus retrograde. It was, quite extraordinary. I go back and I want to look at, first of all, 1990, 32 years earlier. And then before that, I want to look at 1958 and see what sort of things I get out of that. Now, 1990, that's not hard to do. That occurred just as, the Berlin Wall came down, like I said, in November of 89. Putin winds up leaving Germany and going back to St. Petersburg, I think around January or February of 89. But what you got in 1990 was, as sort of as things are really falling apart, you had a Venus-Mars conjunction, I think in the spring of 1990. I'm looking for the date here. Looks like it's
I can bring it up.
It's going to be March of 1990, and it's basically the sort of the picking up the pieces after the Berlin Wall's come down and Gorbachev is not looking too good, and sorry, it's earlier than I just looking for the proper date. You can find the conjunction for me, the Venus-Mars conjunction.
Sure.
Maybe it's in late 89. Because it'll be a return of the first one.
I'll just make a list of Venus-Mars conjunctions.
Yeah, do that while I'm talking. Please.
I'll be your guy at the guy at the chair. All right.
It should be. Yeah, let's. You winning there?
Yep.
I'm doing it too.
Yeah.
All right, here we are.
Oh, no, I don't have it.
You don't have it. Okay,
Wait,
I've got it.
Happened?
Yeah.
I don't know why it's doing that.
Okay, actually, okay, this is the thing. What happened in 2022 with the Venus Mars was beginning a sort of a new part of the cycle. The 32-year return actually is July of 89, you have a Venus Mars conjunction in Leo, and then July of 2021, exactly 32 years later, you have another Venus Mars conjunction in Leo. But because of the shifting nature of both the Venus and Mars cycles, the conjunctions, those three conjunctions we had in 2022, were actually sort of new introductions into the cycle, which does happen as well. You can see here, I'm going to show the audience. Just going to put up these charts.
I have a list which is compiling. Finally, it finally decided.
I've got my list here, and I'll just I'll show the audience this so you see what I'm talking about. Okay. Sorry, here we are. Okay, so this is a bi-wheel. The inner wheel is July 12th, 1989. The outer wheel is July 13th, 2021. And this is a little bit, you know, in both cases, what happened is because Venus went retrograde, it made those three more conjunctions to Mars in early 2022. But this is what you know, the 32 return that I'm talking about, where you get a synodic Venus and Mars return. It just gets a little more complicated. So here we are with 2022. This was the first of those three conjunctions. This is because this Venus retrograde was now happening in Capricorn as opposed to Aquarius with the previous time. Anyway, long story short, I always, if I'm looking at Venus and Mars, sort of their combination, very often it involves these 32 and 64 year returns. And that's what 2022 makes me think of is this period when the Soviet Union was coming apart, and there's like almost a return to that, you know.
Right.
Long story short.
Gotcha. So what are the things? Well, I think sort of thinking back to what we were talking about originally, I think we were talking about what are the Venus stories we didn't really get to in the episode, although I'm happy to go with, you know, whatever you want to talk about.
Yeah, no, that's what I want to talk about too. I mean, the Russian one is certainly good. You know, on the Astrology Podcast, although we've occasionally covered politics, like the Uranus and Gemini thing that Chris and I did late last year. You know, because politics is sort of a niche topic, it's not something that, you know, gets covered on the astrology topic that podcast all that much. So the Russian story is something that I think is worth, you know, since it's such a big item in the news, it's worth talking about. And I've been working with their history for a long time, and there's a lot of really interesting astrology in Russian history. And why not trot it out and use it when you know, events like this come up and people are wondering about it.
Right.
I wanted, there was something I was talking about, you know, last week with, you know, you mentioned Trump coming, you know, into the political arena during the Red 5 of 2015. And I've made some slides since then that I think people will find interesting, if I may share.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I know, you know, you've been working on Trump's life really, you know, earlier than I was. I've sort of caught up in the past year or so to really research his political career, but it wasn't something I really felt like doing while it was happening.
Sure.
I was paying attention to the circus, of course, but I didn't really want to sort of, you know, get into the astrology of it while it was happening. So yeah, Trump, you know, his father died during a Red 5, not long before Putin's father died. So that's something they both have in common, is their dads died during Red 5s in 1999, a few weeks apart, like a month and a half apart or so. Not even, a little more than a month apart. And then later that year, Trump announced on Larry King that he was considering running for president. And this was 27 days after the direct station, just as Venus went into Virgo. He did this interview with Larry King. But then 16 years later, indeed, he announced his candidacy. On this day, 16th of June, this is when he talked about, Mexicans, blah, 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 the famous speeches. This is 28 days before Venus went retrograde in Leo. And then this first debate, the debate where he really clashed with Megyn Kelly, this was Venus retrograde, very close to his ascendant, along with the Mercury and Jupiter. Trump himself, of course, is a black 3 rather. So he's not a Venus retrograde guy, but his ascendant is 29 Leo and he's got Mars there. So when we look at this is it. You don't need to have a natal Venus retrograde for it to be a powerful transit for you. So on this day, when he's having this debate, okay, like I mentioned, he gets into a spat with Megyn Kelly. Megyn Kelly is a red 2, right? Also on the stage that night are Ted Cruz, who's a red 2, and Rand Paul, who's a red 2, and Chris Christie, who's a red 2. And then soon, earlier that day, there was like another debate, and Carly Fiorina who's also a red 2. She wasn't in the first debate with Trump because she was sort of the lower tier debate, but she won that sort of lower tier debate so that by the second debate, she was up on the top tier with everyone else. Then the second debate would have 11 people instead of 10. So that's like 1, 2, 3, 4 of Trump's challengers, or competition for the nomination. They're red 2s, and then Megyn Kelly is also a red 2 with this Venus retrograde, and they get into that spat during the first debate. Amongst the other people on stage that day, there's Jeb Bush, who's a red 1, John Kasich, who's a blue 3, Scott Walker, who's a red 5, Ben Carson, who's a red 5, and where are we here? Huckabee, who's a blue 5, and Rubio, who's a white 1. So in other words, Rubio was the only white interval person on that dais. Huckabee and Kasich are the only blue intervals, or there might be one other blue interval. I'm forgetting who else. Kasich and Huckabee are blue intervals, and then everyone else is a red interval on that debate stage. And the person moderating the debate is a red interval person. And so this is sort of the reason I want to show this example. I know people are tired of Trump, and we are too. But number one, you don't have to have natal Venus retrograde in order for the transits to be powerful for you, like it was for Trump. You saw Venus was going retrograde over his ascendant, along with the Jupiter and Mercury conjunction at the time of that debate. But what does happen is all the people around him involved in his Venus retrograde story, a lot of them are Venus retrograde people as well. If you do have natal Venus retrograde, you might become aware of how you might be a participant in someone else's Venus retrograde transit during the transit. This is what human beings are. We're sort of walking, talking transits. And sometimes someone having some big Venus retrograde event, even if they don't have natal Venus retrograde, whoever their sort of ally or adversary or someone involved in their story, whatever the story is, will very likely be, or very often will be, a Venus retrograde individual as well.
Yeah. The only thing that doesn't make sense about that story, though, is in, the one who was pushing the norms, the one who was like breaking the norms was the non-retrograde figure, and it seemed like all the people who were kind of trying to push back the most against it were the retrograde ones, or the red ones, and that sort of is a little against our understanding of like that the idea that like Venus retrogrades or the red interval people are the people who might be pushing the social consensus in a new direction, or breaking social norms, or somehow standing out for so this is a little bit of a counterintuitive example, but you can't deny that in 1999 at the after that retrograde finished, that was when he like kind of first ran for president. I mean, it's actually not entirely true, because in 87 he like floated it.
He floated it, yeah.
He floated it. but he gave up and pretended like it, or rather basically just turned into him selling his book. That happened actually on my birthday.
Yeah.
Right around right around the time that like Bork was voted down, and there was a lot of weird things going on my birthday. But
Yeah, I remember it well.
yeah. So when we look at for example, this is actually not a bad example of the 4-year interval as well, because in August of 2011, that was in the period. Wait, let me make sure I got this right. August 2011. That was like in the year that he. That was after he basically got shut down at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and
That was that was April 30th,
ashamed.
April 30th, 2011.
Okay, so that would have probably not been in the blue
No,
5 yet. In the
No.
blue 5, he was basically fuming about his foiled bid for 2012, and he like wrote a book in that time, or wrote a book.
Mhm.
But interestingly, he comes out of that conjunction by trying to launch an independent bid for president in 2012, and he eventually gives up in early January, I believe, and endorses Mitt Romney. But like even at the end of even in that sort of later part of the year of 2011, he still has some inclination to do this. So maybe it sort of shows the difference of his experience when the sun is aligned with Venus and Leo when it's direct versus retrograde. Like when it's retrograde, there's enough like social disorder that he can like get through. Whereas when the sun is conjunct Venus and it's direct, it's like the consensus holds or something, and he's not able to break through that. Venus being obscured by the glare of the sun or something like that. Now in 2019, in the summer of 2019, he was president at that time, and I believe he announced his re-election bid in June of 2019, which might conceivably be within the blue interval.
Yeah, I haven't gotten to that interval yet. I know that's around like when he had one of his I think his summit with Modi of India, and there were some other big sort of international things going on. But yeah, I think he did announce his bid around then.
So that just makes sense, because then it's sort of like a weird repeat in some ways of 2011, because ultimately, it doesn't end up going anywhere. He does run obviously for re-election, but he doesn't. The conditions are not the same as when he ran before. So that's what's a little concerning about this Venus retrograde is, will there be enough social discord or chaos that he might actually, his particular brand of...
Look, he's, I've already said, and it's with great regret and trepidation, but that I think he's gonna, he's gonna be on the Republican ticket, and he's probably gonna win. I hope I'm wrong. I say it over and over. Not an endorsement. It's just
right.
The astrology. And for those who haven't seen, S.J. Anderson put out a really good video. He doesn't agree with me. He points out that whenever Saturn has been in Pisces, the incumbent president has always sort of won re-election. It's a really good video. SJ's, a really strong astrologer, and I told him I'm rooting for him. I hope you nail that.
Yeah,
wanker,
and I
already taken best. But I think I'm looking at the Uranus transit through Gemini. Which has a certain sort of implication and really connects with his chart very strong. I guess the main thing I think is that just pointing out that Trump's chart is just so America.
Yeah.
And I know Americans want to hear like, hey, he's not my president, but like it resonates.
He's a star-spangled chart.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, some people have said, well, what if there's a secession thing, and he's the leader of the secessionist movement because he loses the election? Yeah, that could happen because, Jefferson Davis was a
Jefferson
Gemini
Davis,
sun,
yeah,
who had Uranus conjunct his sun when he led this, when he was elected the president of the Confederacy.
right.
In the Revolutionary War, it was King George III who was the Gemini. And when Uranus was conjunct King George III's son, that's when Benjamin Franklin and France, King Louis the 16th of France, got them on board in the war. And really, as we know, France had a big role in helping them, the United States, or what would become the United States, helping the colonists win that war against the British.
Right.
So, sometimes the Uranus transit is the monarch who's being rebelled against, and then sometimes it's the rebel himself. So whether it's King George III or whether it's Jefferson Davis, in the Second World War, well, you had two Geminis who would be presidents who distinguished themselves in battle. John F. Kennedy and George H.W. Bush were both Gemini sons who really sort of they made their reputations on the military achievements that they had during the Second World War, and they wouldn't be like the figures they were. John F. Kennedy might have come from a really rich family, but if he hadn't been really brave in the war and sustained an injury and saved the lives of his crew, then he wouldn't have been a serious contender for the presidency. That money couldn't have bought him that if he didn't have the sort of the war record to sustain it. And similarly, the joke always with George H.W. Bush, he was a pilot during the Second World War. And then, after the war, he went to Yale where he got top grades, but also that's like when his son was born. Like he's married, he's a new father, and he's star of the baseball team and doing really well at Yale. And then years later, he's running against Ronald Reagan for the candidacy of the Republicans. And Ronald Reagan was famous for playing a fighter pilot in a movie, and famous for playing a sports hero in a movie. Whereas George H.W. Bush actually was a fighter pilot and actually was a baseball star in his college. And the actor beat the real deal, which is funny.
Now, one thing I kind of got from reading your book, Uranus USA, which hopefully will get a second edition coming out at some point. That book really made me realize, holy crap, whoever is kind of whatever politicians or big figures are on the scene right now who have the sun in Gemini, they are just due to, it just seems like it's American history is just littered with these sons in Gemini who end up getting that conjunction to the sun, from Uranus, and they end up sort of having this outsized role to play in the surroundings when it comes to the Uranus return or Uranus in Gemini event. So
yeah,
there are some. So who are some of the suns in Gemini right now who
let's see,
being sort of potential people to play a bigger deal later on?
First and foremost, MTG, baby, Margie.
No.
Yep. She was born May 27th, 1974.
Jewish space lady.
Yeah.
I'm not saying she's not Jewish. That's
no,
she's a conspiracy theory.
We know all about the Marjorie Taylor Greene has a Gemini sun. Marco Rubio, Mike Pence, and then of course even William
Tucker Carlson, right?
Tucker Carlson, Rudy Giuliani and William Barr were his allies. I think they've fallen by the wayside now, but they were Geminis. There's a fair number of them. Jared Kushner's younger brother is a Red 5 Gemini sun, Joshua Kushner. I don't know. I mean, probably will just sort of fade into the background, but I would keep my eyes on that younger Kushner. That's just a hunch on my part. But Marjorie Taylor Greene, Marco Rubio, I mean, he's young enough that he could sort of, make a comeback. Oh, good. Misty Radford is vomiting for us. Yeah. Okay. I know we're not talking
Yeah, I'm
about.
not celebrating that. Just knowing that, that's pretty unfortunate.
Yeah. Okay. So
Now, what about the Democratic side or the non-right wing side? Are there Gemini sons who stick out from that side?
let me see here. I'm just going to answer. There's someone in chat who doesn't know what I'm talking about when I say red 5 and all that stuff. There's a video to my introduction to the Venus synodic cycle video. If you haven't seen that, that'll sort of explain at least how the system is created. There are other people who want to know how do you interpret this and what have you. I mean, I'm working on getting this material out. For the time being, there's just the introduction video that shows how they're calculated. We talk about, this live stream is really, the one I do with you and then the one I do alone on Mondays is the day where I really sort of talk about the intricacies of this cycle. It's not all I talk about, but it's something that I frequently talk about. So just to sort of sort you out there and allow you to catch up with everything else we're talking about. Now, what were we saying just before that?
I was asking about Democrats.
Oh yes.
Gemini sons. Although what's crazy is when I just looked up, just did a basic search for something like this, I found a bunch of articles talking about like why are so many Republican politicians Gemini sons?
Yeah.
So there seems to be this like we're tilted. The Republicans there's a lot of Gemini Republicans out there. It seems.
Yeah, I would say that's true. But yeah, let's see. Besides, there's Mike Lee, Marco Rubio, but Democrats, I'm not seeing a lot of Democrats here who are Gemini sons. Not the young ones. If I go to my Congress file here.
It's hilarious to me that Boris Johnson's a Gemini son as well.
Yeah.
Given
He's a red 3. Yeah.
It seems the UK didn't, learn from the United States that, you shouldn't go with like the kind of crazy wild politician with unruly blonde hair.
Well, or I think Orban of Hungary is also a Gemini son, and they're out there in droves. Who else is a Gemini son that I can? All right, we've both gone quiet here.
Okay.
While we're researching, one of us has to talk.
Right. Well, I'll talk a little bit about what I've been working on lately. I don't know anything about coding. I know enough. Like I know how to sort of work with spreadsheets, I guess, not even as much as many other people. But with ChatGPT, you can ask it to give you the code to what you want to achieve. And so over the past few days, I've been working with ChatGPT to create a program which would allow me to calculate the precise dates of heliacal risings and heliacal settings of a given planet, because as you may know, when a planet comes too close to the sun, it loses visibility, it sets, it heliacally sets, and when it departs or gets enough distance from the sun, it heliacally rises, it comes into view. And this phase, or these phases of a planet, usually, with the visible planets at the very least, these will always held to be really important in traditional astrology. There seems to be this general interpretive principle that a planet becomes sort of weakened as it enters the beams of the sun, and then it becomes strengthened as it emerges from the beams, because it's like the planet is sort of renewed and young and full of life and forward direction, whereas it's sort of maybe weakened as it sort of is heading into that glare. Now, the typical rule that's used in astrology for determining whether a planet is heliacally setting or heliacally rising is just looking at whether a planet is within 15 degrees of the sun. Now, for a long time, I thought that was pretty cool. Like, oh, if it's within 15 degrees, it must mean it's invisible, or it must mean it is visible if it's more than 15 degrees from the sun. But what I learned later on is that is only a rough approximation, and that isn't really astronomically correct. So then I was like, okay, well, I want to know when this happens. So I found this ephemeris on astro.com that tells you the times of heliacal risings and heliacal settings. So I thought, oh, that's great. We finally have exact figures for this event. Well, then I found out that that actually depends on where you are on Earth and what elevation your location is in. And that the dates given by that ephemeris from astro.com are probably set for some default location, probably Switzerland, given that it's the Swiss ephemeris. So then I found this program from ages ago that will calculate the exact date of the heliacal rising and heliacal setting for a particular location. So that has served my purposes for a long time, because when I've wanted to really check and make sure if a planet was visible or not, I was just able to go to that program. It's called Planetary, Stellar, and Lunar Visibility. It's ancient. It's from like 2006 or something, but it does exactly what you kind of need it to do. And that's helped me with clients and sort of my own general work. But I've really wanted to understand, how this event actually happens across the Earth, because what I realized is that the heliacal rising is this global event, but it happens in different places at different times. And this has become more important to me because when I was trying to create a spreadsheet to calculate whether a planet was in a blue interval, or a white interval, or a black interval, or a red interval, I suddenly realized, like, wait a sec, we need an exact figure for when a planet heliacally rises or sets, in the case of Venus, because that establishes the boundaries of the blue interval, technically. And while it's good and fine to use the 73 days prior to and after the exterior conjunction, astronomically, the actual date of Venus's heliacal rising or setting will actually depend on where you are on Earth. So what I tried to do then was I wanted to see what this actually looked like. I wanted to know how the heliacal rising actually occurred on Earth. So I used the calculator to basically generate the dates for like a whole bunch of places, like 150 places. And then I fed them into a Google map, and I had it display different colors based on the dates of the heliacal rising. And so for the first time, I think maybe ever, I was able to visualize a global map of when and where the Venus heliacal rising or setting occurs. And it's quite interesting. Now, I'm not positive I want to actually show what that looks like just yet, because I would want to do more research on this. But what I'm saying is over the past few days, and actually just today, I finally really have it down now. ChatGPT gave me the code I need to have a C++ program, a language that I don't know how to write, is now able to generate the precise dates for heliacal risings and settings for nearly 600 locations on Earth. So now that can output correctly, I can just now export this to a spreadsheet, which will be able to make maps of what it will be able to visualize the heliacal risings and heliacal settings of Venus as a global event, showing when and where it happens. And what's so interesting about this is there are potentially places on Earth where the Venus heliacal rising happens first, where there are certain places on Earth that will first see Venus. And I wonder if that could have some significance, or maybe it won't, but either way, we'll finally be able to really see what that event looks like as a kind of global phenomenon. And
It's
it
so
may be useful.
It's so important. It is sort of the holy grail of astrological calculation because it's so location specific. It's not like the greater elongations that bookend the red intervals because they occur about 71, 72 days before and after the interior conjunction. You get this sort of standard, the greatest elongation is the same no matter where on Earth you're looking from. The geocentric perspective still gives you the same distance between them. But yeah, heliacal rising and setting, when a planet first becomes visible or is last visible before disappearing, that is a more sort of, there's more of a variable to that. And it's been a difficult thing to sort of integrate into other astrology calculations, that done by other softwares. There is that one program you found that does it, but it's not sort of integrated in a greater sort of astrological calculating machine
Until now.
until now.
Until
Yeah.
now, just this little application I've made on my computer can now do it, and I'd like to automate it further so that it will, also automatically, make maps of it and everything. But that's, this
Yeah.
was like the first step, and so we now can have that. Thanks, shout out to the Swiss Ephemeris Library.
And shout out to you. I mean, this is Patrick and I have been looking into all the different ways we can, use this sort of new technology to improve, astrological calculation, to improve our grasp of it and our ability to calculate it and integrate it into what we do. And yeah, Patrick, this is a huge step, and on behalf of the entire astrology community, I would like to thank you
Well,
for your effort.
well,
I do presume to speak for the entire community.
I think heliacal risings, they're like something that has been a very important part of astrology for a long time, but never quite calculated to this extent. Now, maybe a later step would be to import some like topographical APIs so that we can have like, every degree of longitude and latitude covered, in the map. So you could have an even more granular level of detail. As it is, there's about 600 locations, which include all of the world capitals and US state capitals, the most populated cities on Earth, the lowest points and highest points of elevation, at least in the United States. So, I mean, I'll have to sort of incorporate more and find more, because the difficult thing is it's easy to get coordinates for locations. It's a little trickier to find elevation, which is the other variable that goes into calculating these heliacal rising events. But the real test is once we can finally get a bird's eye view on this kind of event. And one thing to keep in mind is it does actually span quite a bit of time. For example, the upcoming Venus heliacal setting will start in the first week of July in the northern hemisphere, the extreme northern hemisphere, and it will eventually move down over that month. I think, one of the last places that we'll see Venus set will be like New Zealand around like August 13th. So,
or Buenos Aires, maybe, or something like that.
My map sort of shows how the Venus kind of disappears as it sort of starts in the north and moves south over the
But
globe.
in other instances, it'll start south and move north, depending on where it's happening.
Yeah, we don't know exactly.
So, yeah.
We'll
So
have to see. I'm going to try to do at least. I want to. My goal is to do maps for each heliacal rising and setting event within an 8-year period, so that we kind of have every recent version of how each one happens.
If I'm thinking this through clearly, I imagine that red in contemporary times, red 3s, 5s, and 2s will go north to south. Red 1s and 4s will go south to north.
And that's based on the loops, right?
Yeah, and well, what signs they happen in. Yeah, but I might be wrong. I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah.
That's how I imagine they're gonna work, depending on whether they're in the winter signs or the summer signs.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I could be wrong, but I think
Yeah,
that's how that's going to play out when you do the calculation.
right.
That's a fantastic. Like Patrick, you just told me this morning that you'd accomplished this, and I'm thrilled because this really is like one of the great holy grails of astrology in terms of taking classical astrology and integrating it into our technology. We can calculate zodiacal releasing, we can calculate charts, and all that stuff for different locations, but this is really something so specialized and really is beyond the technology that we've had until this point to sort of incorporate it into what we do. So yeah, I think this is a big thing
It's
that you've done.
yeah. Well, it's really funny though, because this actually was accessible to us prior to ChatGPT. It just took knowing a little bit of C++, and that was just something I didn't have and was kind of overwhelmed by it. But ChatGPT made it extremely easy
Right.
to do, to the point where even an idiot like me, was able to actually make a C++
And
program that can do
and I
this.
can I can vouch he's an idiot, but still,
Yeah, I
this is
mean, you know,
just kidding.
so
Yeah,
but this is what I think. This is a huge testament, though, to what like is possible now. You know, with this tool, with ChatGPT, that you can make anything. Now, I mean, and now that I've kind of had a taste of this, I'm like, I mean, there's nothing really stopping me from like, I mean, I could like make a whole app or a whole software program with the exact sort of specifications that I want, because I really love Solarfire, but like they're really cramping my style with the updates every decade. um and I there are some functions I really would wish could be different, so maybe this is I wonder if we could cook something up that would
yeah,
make sense for the kind of work you want to do. Like, wouldn't it be cool to have, a phase interval analysis tool in Solarfire, and not just for Venus, but for Mercury as well,
yeah.
and
Yeah,
for the other
all the
planets
planets make heliacal risings and
to
settings, and yeah.
examine them in the same way. So yeah, it really has thrown open, the doors,
Yeah,
for any old person to do what they
sure
want.
has, sure has. Oh yeah, no, this is huge, Patrick, and I'm thrilled that you've done this, and yeah, we're gonna be taking this whole astrology thing to some new level with what we can do now.
Yeah,
No doubt about it. I'm
hopefully.
thinking, we've done a 2-hour show. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of fading, and I've
All
got
right.
some things that I got to
Yeah.
get to.
Yeah. No worries.
But
Yeah. Of
this
course.
is, I think this is a great crescendo. Your revelation today and what you've shared with us. So I think that's also,
Oh,
it's just,
thanks.
there's no following that. Yeah. What am I supposed to
Well,
do? Go back and talk about Trump
yeah,
again? No, I think
I will. Yeah, I mean, I'll probably. I still have some more work to do, but I still have to make like the maps. But like once I've done that, then I might want to, kind of present my findings on, you know, the movement of each heliacal rising and setting event for Venus,
yeah,
and what sort of happens. And ideally I'd like to take that information and see if it what astrological significance it has. Are the places where Venus touches down first, are those
yeah.
somehow the centers of these
That
events? Like,
would,
what is
yeah,
the
yeah,
that's really what I would be curious to know,
yeah,
is what the usefulness of it might be. So
yeah. Just one last answer. Laura pointed out, she said Peter from AstroSeek has really been charging through with consistent updates. Have I spoken to him? Actually, I have. Peter did a great job adding my phase and interval map into AstroSeek. So if you're wondering if you're like a black 3 or a red 2 or whatever, you can go to astro-seek.com and astro-seek.com and find that phase and interval counter and look up what you are. But I spoke to Peter because he did such a great and fast job putting that together. I asked him before Patrick accomplished what he's just accomplished, and Peter said he'd looked into it for a long time and decided it was beyond his capacity. Now, could that change down the road? Sure. Patrick's just demonstrated that it's possible. So yeah, but I have spoken to Petter, and at the time he said it was beyond his capacity to do.
I think, it's also possible that Petter was probably thinking of doing it in like a more comprehensive way, which
Yes.
would be, which would maybe take a little longer, but not out of reach. Not out
Yeah.
of reach. Like, but I basically just had to throw a really wide net and just like try to get as many places as possible. If you really want to do it properly, you'd probably want to like cover every degree at least of longitude and latitude of the whole planet, with the elevation data for each one, and you would need a specialized, that's how many pieces. That would be like 360 times.
That's why we're going with AI with this, because I think just your standard sort of computer calculation, it's beyond to put all those.
I mean, I'm sure Petter could probably figure it out. I don't want to make it sound like, I outsmarted the great Petter with my chat GPT. I like I said, that GPT did the heavy lifting. I just had to like endless tweaking of,
I believe Petter watches the live stream. He certainly, like, all I did once on the live stream, I mentioned the fact that I wanted the red intervals to begin and end on the greatest elongations instead of just the basic 73 days on either side. And within a couple of days, he, without me, I was about to ask him if he could do that, and he wrote to me saying, "Oh, I've just done this."
That's classic Petter.
So
That's
classic Petter. Like, so he was ahead of me on that, and he might be watching the show and just saw your announcement, and he's already off, and he'll have it done by the end of the day something.
Well, I'm happy to share my code. If he wants that, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah. All right. On that note, Petter, if you're listening, balls in your court, dude. All right. And besides that, Patrick, where can people find you? Who are you?
I'm Patrick Watson. You can find me at patrickwatsonAstrology.com. You can also see my Twitter handle down there, pwatsonastro. I'm here for as long as it still standing longer than I thought. And I'm on other social medias as well with the same handle.
Okay, and I'm Nick Dagan Best. My website is nickdaganbestastrologer.com. So remember, his is patrickwatsonAstrology.com. Mine is nickdaganbestastrologer.com, because we can't possibly be in sync on anything other than the banter we bring to this live stream. And that there's
Patrick Watson. If you
there are no wrong choices. There are no wrong choices.
If you go to patrickwatsonAstrologer.com, you're gonna read a bunch of scammy articles.
That's right. That's right. Someone usurped you.
Yeah, basically someone stole my domain, and I haven't been able to get it back, and they want to extort me for a ridiculous amount of money for it. So that's why I'm patrickwatsonAstrology.com. I used to have patrickwatsonAstrologer.com.
Okay. Well, maybe someone will steal my account. Please don't. But if they do, then I'll direct you to nickdaganbestastrology.com.
Right.
Then we'll be. All right. Well, good stuff. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And please remember, Patrick and I are working astrologers who are raising families as consultants. So if you like what we do, consider booking a consultation with either of us. And we live stream. We do this team stream every Sunday afternoon, 2 p.m. Eastern time, 11 a.m. Pacific time. And I also do my solo live stream on Mondays, the same time. So I'll see some of you tomorrow, maybe all of you, some of you, you're all welcome to my live stream. And of course, Patrick and I will be back together next Sunday for more exciting adventures and revelations, and probably some more. We still only covered a little bit of the Venus retrograde stuff we want to cover. We do talk about other subjects, but I guess as we're heading into the Venus retrograde and we've just done the big podcast episode, it's probably going to be something that we want to keep chatting about if it interests you. But by all means, if you think it's boring the hell out of you, either tune out or beg us to cover some other.
Let us know.
And we'll consider it. All right, Patrick, have yourself a fantastic Sunday. Have a fantastic week, everyone. Thank you so much. Hope to see some of you tomorrow on my solo stream. And that's it. I'm fresh out of words.
All right. See you guys.
Bye, Patrick.
Bye.